Hello and welcome to session 3 of Module 5. And in this session, we're exploring a vast area, which is music therapy experiences with students with additional needs. And because this area is quite vast, we're going to separate our session 3 into parts 1 and parts 2. So you are so very welcome to part 1. So we're going to start with our learning objectives, and these are across both parts 1 and 2 of this session 3. So in this session, we are going to aim to learn about what is neurodivergence, focusing on what is autism and dyslexia. We're going to consider what music learning from a neurodivergent perspective might be. We're going to learn a variety of approaches to offering musical experiences to neurodivergent students. And we're going to be offered some practical tools and suggestions when teaching neurodivergent students. So what is neurodivergence? Well, one way to explain is to say that neurodivergence is the diverse ways our brains process information. Some examples of categories of neurodivergences include autism, dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia, and we're going to be looking at each of those more closely. Okay, we're going to start with autism. What is autism? Now, a little caveat before we begin our discussion around autism. I'm going to, as much as possible, use identity first language, which means I'll be, for example, using the phrase autistic person as opposed to person with autism. Now, either of these turns of phrases might be preferred by an individual, but there is a recognition right now amongst the autism community and advocates that identity first language is the majority preference. And so that's what I'm going to aim to use as much as possible in our session. So autism is a spectrum, a range of ways of experiencing the world, typically in the areas of communication and social interaction. And by social interaction, we mean the reflexive sequence of social actions between individuals or groups. And these interactions form social structure. So they might include words, body language, facial expressions, tone, voice, derived subtext, all of which may be difficult for an autistic person to understand and process. And an autistic person might also experience something called context blindness, which involves being unaware and unable to read social norms. For example, difficulty in interpreting social communication, that nonverbal social communication, the signals that we give each other every day. So communication does include speech and language, body language, facial expressions, and the nuances within each of these. Autistic people may also experience repetitive patterns of behavior, particularly when in response to sensory overload, and these might include stimming. So stimming is self-stimulatory behavior, and it is an example of self-regulation. And stimming might look like a series of repeated actions like waving or flapping hands or jumping up and down. And just to define sensory processing, so sensory processing is how we interact with and interpret the world around us through our five senses. An autistic person might process this sensory data and stimuli differently as either hypersensitive, so the sensory information is too much, so the music might be too loud, the lights too bright, the smells and scents too strong, or hyposensitive, which means not enough, so underactive, seeking louder music, seeking extra light, and someone who is hypersensitive might not notice scents or smells around them. The sensory integration is the process by which we organize and use the information we receive from our senses. I'm going to introduce you now to the wonderful Donna Williams, who sadly died in 2017. And Donna Williams was an Australian writer, artist, singer-songwriter, screenwriter, and sculptor. And Donna was diagnosed with autism in 1991 following multiple misdiagnoses, and Donna wrote 4 autobiographies. And this is an extract from The Jumbled Jigsaw, an insider's approach to the treatment of autistic spectrum fruit salads. It's a really wonderful analogy, so I'm going to read it to you now. Donna says, okay, so you landed in the world of those who are developmentally challenged and you're looking for an instruction manual. Most likely you'll get instead a label, autism or Asperger's syndrome or PDD-NOS or some other umbrella term, as though you had one fruit, and this type of fruit will always taste the same if it's got the same label. And maybe you think you all got some kind of apple. Like one of you got the autism apple, we might think of as a golden delicious. And another one of you got the Asperger's apple, we might think of as maybe a Granny Smith. And one of you got one of those PDD nose type apples we might think of as a pink lady. But what if these weren't single definable variations on one fruit? In fact, what if each were strange fruit indeed? And the more you get used to it, the more you might find it may have many different flavors. And sometimes it's not one fruit at all, but a well-disguised blend of fruit salad. And you confused it for a mere apple. What's more, what if the combined ingredients in each of these fruit salads and the amounts of each in each concoction differed slightly in each case? One piece of fruit may be that of information processing issues, another of sensory perceptual issues, another of communication issues, another of anxiety disorders, another of mood disorders, another of compulsive disorders, and another of sense of self, environmental dynamics, identity, and personality issues. And that is just the fruit on top. So I love that analogy from Donna. And note that Asperger syndrome and PDD-NOS are no longer specified in the DSM, as diagnoses were often subjective according to the clinician, and these classifications are not reflective. We understand now that they're not reflective of the nature of the autism spectrum. And we also don't use terms such as high functioning and low functioning now because they are also considered outdated. But I know that when Donna wrote this analogy, that certainly wasn't the case. She was working with the best of the knowledge surrounding her at the time. And I really love that chapter and that analogy. So how do music therapy and autism link? So a Cochrane report in 2014 recognized the efficacy of music therapy for autistic people. A Cochrane report is a collaborative review, which only includes really empirically defined studies. So studies of a very specific nature, with specific empirical boundaries surrounding their process. And so the Cochrane report carries great efficacy because of this, because only certain studies are allowed within a Cochrane review. So Cochrane reviews are made available publicly, and this one we can read online, and we've attached the link just below there. So the Cochrane report said within the area of music therapy and autism, music therapy can address goals in the areas of communication, social interaction, and sensory processing. So let's look at the area of communication. We're all innately musical, even before birth. And rhythm is evident in our heartbeat, our walking, running, and breathing. We use pitch and tone for expression in our voices, from laughing to crying. Even for a person who is highly isolated, these musical elements are always there and offer a powerful channel for communication. And music is relational, as we've observed and as we're discovering, and through music therapy, we're open to new channels of nonverbal communication and are heard and responded to. For example, in communication with fellow musicians. And as Pavlocevic, so Pavlocevic is a very well-renowned and respected Nordic Province community music therapist, Pavlocevic described in her concept of dynamic form that improvisation reveals both personal and musical qualities about those engaged in playing. Therefore, both qualities can be derived from our musical communication, not only about our music, but also about ourselves. And we looked a little bit at that around that area of improvisation in our previous session. So the structures in music, which are nurtured, framed, and guided by the therapist, can offer platforms from which communication can develop. For example, with improvisation, as we saw in the previous session, we can offer grounding, holding, or containing framework from which the client can safely express and communicate that which is within them or that which is them. Another example being the structure of a familiar song, the predictability and safety of which might provide encouragement to vocalize. So that familiarity and that structure might really prompt us to vocalize and to engage in our own our own interpretation of the song. So, using creatively varied structures, moods, styles of approach, the autistic child may begin to discern hourly the varied temporal musical shapes that underpin and organize meaningful two-way communication. And that was from Robarts in 1996. So going back to our earliest interactions between us and our mothers, our caregivers, musical interactions have been compared to the interactions of mother and baby. And so Prevner in 2000 developed a form of musical interaction therapy within a cohort of preschool autistic children based on the similarities between musical and mother-baby interactions. She encouraged parents of the children within the cohort to join in with the spontaneous vocalizations their children made, and in this way children were encouraged to follow their parents' lead and develop a type of conversation. So we know that communication is inherent within music making. Communication and music making go hand in hand. So let's look at music and social interaction. Music is a social experience and focuses on what we share as human beings. What's our commonality? Rhythm, pitch, and playfulness are cues to communication from early infant interaction and throughout our life. So within a music therapy session, we create opportunities for musical and non-musical interactions within a safe and non-invasive environment. And we are sharing with you an article here, and this article explores a music therapy group with autistic adolescents. And Erin in 2015 stated that music therapy interventions are effective in improving the social interaction and communication skills of adolescents with ASD. The simulation of real-life experiences within the safety of the music therapy sessions help adolescents with ASD to understand how social interaction and communication occurs in real life. The music therapy group provided an opportunity for adolescents with ASD to attempt social interactions in a safe environment where they would not be judged because of their incorrect actions. They had the chance to change their ways of interacting. The musical environment gave them the chance to experience real-life situations in an indirect, safe, and non-judgmental setting. So we're going to move to sensory processing now. And sensory accommodation is the reflexive system by which our bodies adapt and adjust in order to ensure our survival according to the stream of incoming sensory information we receive. So it's the system by which we interpret and respond to the sensory information that is incoming all the time. So first, our responses to this information are evaluated emotionally in the subcortical brain. So this lets us know, are we safe? And this might induce our fight or flight impulse, for example. And a practical example of this might be if we landed in Chile at high altitude. Although we might struggle initially, our body is going to adapt our breathing rate to circulate more oxygen. And this is a beautiful example of how our bodies can respond and adapt according to our sensory information. So these adaptations become further inscribed over time and even through generations where needed. Berger in 2002 states that music therapy uses elements of music to help a system learn to handle new ways of responding to sensory input. Music therapy helps the system allay fear, reduce stressors, and enjoy functional adaptation to requirements for our planet and our society. So how do we communicate through music? Well, music has existed to communicate emotion from our earliest days. In other words, music was inherent to our means of survival. In our brain, our amygdala and hypothalamus receive the signal that music is communicating calm, and our whole system relaxes as we have evolved to do. So this is the beautiful thing, that music can connect with our most ingrained systems of relaxation and calmness and safety. And this allows the upper learning neocortex area of our brain to be safe and open to learning. Now we have the rhythm in music, the beautiful magic that the rhythm of music can guide us to alignment and to being together and to syncing in communication. So rhythmic entrainment, our bodies receiving information from our motor and auditory cortex and aligning our body's rhythm to an outside rhythmic beat. And through music therapy, we're teaching the system to adapt to new stimuli, and our brain is receiving new information and generating a better understanding of sensory information by being constantly disrupted by the new musical stimuli. So by introducing new musical stimuli, we're creating new pathways and new adaptations and new responses. So here are some practical examples that we found with those we've worked with those autistic students and clients that we have worked with. So we found that it really helps to keep the room clutter-free. To seat, if we're in a classroom, to seat the student towards the front, that might really help them engage and focus. To use clear classroom routines and avoid sudden changes. To try to give instructions on what to do and avoid what not to do. So really providing clarity around what we need to do. To illustrate expectation visually, and that really would help consolidate to know what is expected of us. To support oral presentations with visual aids, charts, diagrams, and we're going to explore more about that, the importance of that multi-sensory input a little bit further in this session. To set tasks with clear goals, to use short, simple instructions, to use the student's name to really prompt them when asking a question or giving an instruction, to let them know to tune in. To avoid metaphorical language, so be as clear and direct in your language as possible, avoiding any language which has nuance or a variety of meaning. To ask direct, closed questions to assess students' understanding. And to prevent repetitive questioning interruptions, could you set up a numbering system to use so that everyone knows that they will have their opportunity to ask their question? And to allow the student to work alone if they choose rather than in a group where possible. If you're doing group work within a class situation, to give clear, concise roles and rules within the group when writing, and to avoid tasks based solely on talking or presenting. And if a student becomes anxious, to allow them to remove themselves, to give them the space to go to an agreed place, to calm down and just to be on their own, and to reset their sensory system and allow them that time out, that space away, and to return when they can. So we have two lovely videos for you to watch. Both are from Nora Robbins' music therapy approach and model, as we explored in our previous session. So please enjoy, and I would love you to write down any reflections or observations that you might notice when watching these videos. The first video is around developing our speech and language skills, and the second video is a beautiful young girl called Kennedy. So now we're going to have a look and a focus around dyslexia. So dyslexia affects people's ability to process written information and might also affect sound discrimination, phonological awareness, short-term memory, sequential processing, and motor coordination. Here in Ireland, the Ministry of Education roughly reports 450,000 people in Ireland have dyslexia, or around 3 in every classroom. So that's an important figure, and it's quite high here in Ireland. Perhaps you might discover the figures where you're tuning in from or where you're working. And we invite you to watch this TED Talk on what is dyslexia to explore a little bit more about what dyslexia is. These are all some words associated with music and dyslexia, including language, timing, repetition, all words that we're going to explore now, and words that are very relevant to our considerations when we're thinking about how we're going to provide the best opportunities for our dyslexic learners. So Rose in 2009 published Identifying and Teaching Children and Young People with Dyslexia and Literacy Difficulties. And Rose stated that dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty primarily affecting the skills involved in accurate and fluent reading and spelling. So primarily affecting reading and spelling. Characteristic features include difficulties in phonological awareness. That means the sounds that make up the words, the small chunks of sounds that make up words, verbal memory, and verbal processing speed. Dyslexia occurs in a continuum across all ranges of intellectual ability. This means that there's a broad range of symptoms within the spectrum of dyslexia, ranging from very mild to more severe. But dyslexia is not an indicator for intellectual ability, and that is so important. Dyslexia is not an indicator for intellectual ability. There's a broad range of symptoms within the spectrum of dyslexia, but there's no correlation between dyslexia and intellectual ability. Although co-occurring difficulties might be noticed in aspects of language, motor coordination, mental calculation, concentration, and personal organization, these are not independent markers of dyslexia. So these alone don't tell us, don't inform us that someone might be experiencing dyslexia. There are a variety of types of dyslexia. One is phonological dyslexia, in which someone experiences difficulty in recognizing and blending sounds into words. For example, difficulty in breaking words into syllables or shorter chunks. Surface dyslexia, difficulty in reading words that are spelled differently to how they sound, and words such as yacht or subtle in the English language. Surface dyslexia can also be known as visual dyslexia, as it is difficult to recognize words by sight. But dyslexia is not connected to our visual range, only a difference in how someone's brain recognizes words or visual language processing. There's also rapid automatic naming dyslexia, and someone might need more time to recognize letters and numbers, or there is double deficit dyslexia, in which someone might have a combination of two of the above. So this is a visual perspective of what it might be like for a dyslexic learner to read a paragraph here on Wikipedia. This is a visual example of what it might be like to attempt to read and how challenging it might be. And I think it's really, really great for us to have this visual representation and to see what the challenges someone with dyslexia might experience when reading. So what areas can dyslexia affect outside of reading and spelling and our language skills? So dyslexia might affect our self-confidence, our motivation, our anxiety, and our energy levels. So now we're going to look at the links between dyslexia and music. So what are the links between both? And then therefore, how can music learning and music therapy input into benefit someone with dyslexia? So both music and language are human-made sounds. They're complex, structured material that unfolds over time, and we're going to come back to that consideration of time and timing. They are small units combined into larger units. So in both dyslexia, in both music and language, we have smaller units, for example, syllables and phrases within a wider sphere. And they are social, communicative, and emotional by nature. There is a really interesting link between dyslexia and timing that continues to be uncovered. And the underlying causes of the language and literacy difficulties experienced by dyslexic children are not yet fully understood, but multiple current theories suggest that timing deficits might be a key factor. So dyslexic children have been found to exhibit timing challenges in the areas of language, music, perception, and cognition, as well as motor control. Timing skills are found to be linked to phonological challenges related to temporal processing difficulties and encompassing the auditory and motor domains. This may mean that students find difficulties with rhythm exercises such as rhythm tapping and keeping the sense of time. And this is from Wolf, Michel, Overroot, and Drake in 1990, and Nicholson, Fawcett, and Dean in 1995. Overy in 2001 found a correlation between spelling ability and the skill of tapping out the rhythm of a song, which both involve the skill of syllable segmentation, breaking down the syllables in a word. And this could provide a direct correlation between developing musical skills and developing literacy, spelling, and language skills in general, a very important correlation. So I'm going to offer you some reading now, and I really do encourage you to read this really interesting article, which was published in the British Psychological Society, called Dyslexia in Tune but Out of Time, and it really delves further into our understanding of the link between timing and dyslexia. So how do learning music and speech development correlate? So music and language are two separate ways in which the human being communicates, but have lots of similarities. Both are ways of communication that use auditory unit sequences. They both might be elaborate, settled, and culturally definite. Both engage attention and memory so that we're able to handle incoming information and to give an interpretation to them. So both music and language are something that happens in time. Finally, language as well as music develops naturally in children, but for both of them, years and training may be required to be able to hone skills. And this demonstrates how literacy might be linked with musical skill, and it opens a door to consider music might be helpful for dyslexic children's development, and in particular for the development of their writing, spelling, and reading skills. We have lots of evidence supporting this link between language and music development. And some of this evidence are on this slide. So we see that musical activities are associated with facilitated basic auditory processing. That was Buchanan and al. In 2013. Music education is associated with better pitch processing in speech. Music education is associated with better processing of speech and noise. So when we hear lots of noise around us, we can still process the speech and focus in on our one line of speech. Music education is associated with prosody perception, so patterns of stress and intonation in speech. Phoneme awareness and reading skills are associated with music skills. Music education is related to verbal memory skills. And one study by Corrigan and Trainer in 2011 found that in 6 to 9-year-old children, the length of music training was associated with reading comprehension performance. So far transfer of skills following controlling for age, socioeconomic status, auditory perception, full-scale IQ, the number of hours children spent reading each week, and word decoding skills. And finally, participating in an active music-making class at 6 to 12 months was associated with increased pre-verbal communication gestures when compared to a play class with music only in the background. Really interesting. So let's have a closer look at this transfer of effects of music on language skills. So language and music processing share many brain areas and networks. Music training facilitates auditory system development. Music training is associated with benefits in speech processing and several verbal and reading measures, and vice versa. So speakers of tonal languages are better at processing pitch in music, i.e. languages that communicate through tone as well as word and letter formation. So we're thinking about things like inflection when we're asking a question. And that is from Ford, Drescher and Brown in 2009. So here we have a graph showing some of the similar areas of the brain that we use for language and music. And we can see that, that music lights up our brains, and we can see all the areas of our brains that we need to engage in verbal communication and language processing. And here's some musical training corresponding positively with language skills. So here's some more information about this correlation between musical training and increased language skills. So music processing, i.e. melody, rhythm, meter, timbre, harmony, phrasing and contour, and general auditory processing, which is pitch discrimination, pitch memory, rapid spectrotemporal processing, which just means the fast processing of the auditory information we're receiving, and leads to language and literacy skills, reading, phonological awareness, pitch processing and speech, prosody perception, verbal memory, and verbal fluency. Other factors resulting from musical training which may link into this chart include improved attention, improved sequencing skills, so music training leading to improved auditory rapid spectral temporal processing, again our fast processing of our audio information, improved processing of linguistic components, for example the syllables, and it leads to improved language skills, and then improved literacy skills. So these are some of the areas in which dyslexic learners of music report some challenges. So reading, musical notation, particularly sight reading and singing, learning new music quickly, rhythmic difficulties, especially from notation, music theory, scanning music and following a conductor, mapping from music to instrument, especially fingerings, aural, especially dictation and sequencing, sustained concentration, notation, sight reading and sight singing, eye, ear, hand coordination, sequential recognition, counting rests, transposing music, reading words and music at the same time, maintaining a steady beat, processing and remembering instructions, decoding information, i.e. music theory, organization, time, for example, getting to lessons on time, getting to rehearsals, organizing practice times, etc. So we can support our dyslexic learners with some visual modifications. So although dyslexia does not indicate a difference of vision, there are ways we can make visual processing easier for those with dyslexia. So today we're considering visual modifications in the context of the music experiences of our dyslexic students, colleagues, loved ones, clients. So visual modifications as a starting point, these are just a few initial suggestions. So we're going to look at photocopying bigger. We're going to look at using modified stave notation, using different color backgrounds, and using different fonts under music notes. Aspects of color. So looking closely at color. So a different color overlay might help the student. Or we can use off-white paper for music and computers, for example. And students should be able to choose which colored overlay they prefer, which is best for their eyes. And color overlays, we can order them in several available locations. Some that we have here are dyslexiadublin.ie, amazon.co.uk. So I'm sure you'll be able to find them in where you're listening right now. So there is a colorimeter test that can be done through an optometrist if it's advised, which assesses and advises techniques to reduce visual stress. So we can use colored notes, Kodai colored Solfa system in musical notation software, such as MuseScore, Finale, or Sibelius. If color coding is really effective if the student chooses their own color. So again, going back to the importance of choosing the own color that works as particularly well for them, their own preference of color. Color coding can be used to indicate patterns or track the music to the next stave. I'm going to give an example of this now. So this score shows with yellow and pink highlights that someone has used their highlighter to track the music from one stave to the next to make it easier to follow. And we can also see Twinkle Twinkle Little Star in color using that Kodai color method that we just mentioned. So thinking about the visual format of a score, so some things to consider might be the proportions of the bars, the direction of the stems, how visually busy the score is, and the visual layout of rhythmic groupings. So just a note on copyright that in an exam situation, although you have to have an original score present, modifications are always allowed to enable the musician to better read the score. So no, please don't be afraid of making any modifications that are going to help you perform and be able to read the music easily. So modified stave notation, which is MSN. So it's widely used in the UK and elsewhere. A MuseScore can modify notation inputted by a teacher or by any individual. MSN not only enlarges the music, but alters the proportions. For example, the font size for fingerings can be increased much more than the size of notepads, so we can decide what we want in a bigger font or a smaller font. Lines for note tails can be made thicker or thinner. Articulation marks can be made bigger. Text is an Arial bold font. Dynamics can consistently be above or below the stave, whichever we find easier to read. We can put it into landscape format to minimize having to track back to the next line. And music can be printed on colored paper and bound however you wish. And you can request any aspect of the score to be made bolder, larger, or placed somewhere specific. So it can be really helpful. And here we have some lovely examples. Here's Burley's in Braille. And we can see the use of color here. the use of proportional notation. Yeah. The FourScore app for iPads can also modify scores, or rewriting through Sibelius can make it much easier to process. So we've lots of lovely examples about modified state notations there. So when we're giving written info, these are some pointers. So avoid handwritten material where possible. Avoid Times New Roman. Have the font size to be at least 12, at least 1.5 spacing, and avoid italics, underlines, and capitals. So how can we help? Well, we can sound first and write the music later. So introduce music by sound first. Asking the question, do we need to use written music? We can be multisensory, that word multisensory again, and we're going to dive deeper into what that means. And we can use lots of repetition. So here we go. So some questions we can ask. Is our student or client engaging with the right instrument for them? And considering that dyslexic learners frequently mix up stimuli, teaching has to be structured, cumulative, and thorough. After anything has been mixed up, it may be very difficult to regain clarity. So less is more. So what that means is that we ensure that we've consolidated any new information before moving on to the next piece of information. So new material should be introduced only after previous knowledge has been safely and repeatedly secured. For reasons shown above, repetition is really, really important so that we can secure that information before moving on to the next piece. We want to identify and repeat patterns and sequences found within rhythm, melody, and overall structure. We really want to engage in a multisensory approach. And some examples of this might be saying a scale aloud as we play it. So incorporating both audio and kinesthetic learning. So kinesthetic part is us engaging in the fingerings, and the auditory part might be us saying the scale as you go, or incorporating movement to practice and identify rhythms. And this activates and accesses more parts of the brain, thus accessing new neural pathways and new neural resources. So because we're using slightly more of the brain and we're engaging more of the brain, waking up more parts of the brain, can be so helpful in making new patterns and engaging in new neural resources. So building associations using images or reminders, for example, D major, fish and chips, F and C sharp, or putting words and rhymes to rhythmic patterns, associating and linking new music learning with already stable knowledge and creating new connections. So let's think about how we can break it down. This is a big way in which we can help, breaking down into smaller chunks. So during the session or the lesson, we can outline the content and summarize during and at the end. Have a clear structure where possible. We'll chunk information into smaller bites, break down tasks, and systematic learning, so making sure of one pointer skill before continuing. So this is a sample structure for how we might introduce a new piece. So we might have an overall introduction initially to the whole piece, so hearing the whole piece straight through first. Then we might identify patterns in the structure, look at the structure as a whole and identify some patterns. Then we might identify patterns in the rhythm and then in the melody. And then we might take small sections and repeat. So let's see, what approaches are we going to use to benefit dyslexic learners? Multisensory, going to absorb and interpret the structure and the rhythm, and solfege ear training to develop auditory processing and sight singing. So now we're going to have a strengths-based focus because our dyslexic learners have some incredible strengths that they bring to every environment that they enter. And some strengths might be big picture thinking, so seeing things as a whole. They might have amazing problem-solving skills and thinking outside the box, wonderful visual skills, and wonderful spatial skills. And they might be really, really good at spotting patterns and noticing differences. So now we're going to show you a wonderful video focused around strength-based perspective. And this is with Kira Knightley and Orlando Bloom, which is two of the people in this video. which is called Dyslexia as a Superpower. And it's a beautiful view of dyslexia as a kind of a superpower, and how these people who we all recognize and who are very accomplished in all of their fields have used their dyslexia and found it to be of a great strength and a great advantage. So let's have a little recap. So we're going to keep instructions to one or two parts within a classroom environment. We're going to allow students to recall the information to better understand it. So we're going to use an active listening strategy. We're going to avoid moving around as the teacher and avoid standing in an area of clutter. We're going to keep a quiet classroom, avoiding noise, clutter, such as shouting out answers, etc. We're going to model tasks to provide an example of the finished product as a way to provide instructions without relying on words only. We're going to keep a strict class routine, avoiding sudden changes. Write down or send work in steps. Keep students towards the front of the classroom to keep them motivated and avoiding disengagement, and allow students to work with others in the class on project-based work. And we're going to consider other styles of assessments rather than essays or written exams, such as presentation, project, or portfolio. So again, some of that outside the box thinking. And keeping the learning multi-sensory as possible, auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, incorporating all our senses. So students often prefer seeing, feeling, discussing, and doing rather than listening, reading, and writing. We might use a pastel color as background on smartboard and try to write in colors such as blue, green, or red pen, and not black, as this reduces stark contrast and aids visual processing. We might use yellow paper for handouts for the same reasons. We might use size 14 font in 1.5 line spacing in Arial, Comic Sans, Courier New, or Open Dyslexic font. It's a free add-on. Or we might use assistive technology like scan pens or text-to-speech programs. And we might allow extra time to complete assignments and exams, and allow extra time for loans in the library. Here are our references and our links. Thank you so much. I really hope you've enjoyed part 1 of session 3. And we are going to be returning to this topic and this subject in part 2.